I always knew there was a purpose for my life. My parents were married for over 22 years. They could not have any children. And finally, after 22 years, I was born into their life. I was truly a miracle in their life. They didn't think I'm gonna be born alive, because after all, a mother in her 50s all of a sudden found out she's pregnant. She had gone to the doctor. She thought she had cancer. Her stomach was growing harder. She went to the doctor to do blood work. She thought, I have cancer. What else could it be for a woman in her 50s? The doctor ran the blood tests, and then he told her, you are pregnant. You're gonna have a baby in 2 months. My parents couldn't believe it. They were overjoyed. When I was born, they didn't even have a name picked up for me because they did not know if I'm going to be born alive. And finally, after I am born, they bring me home. The whole family were gathered together to welcome this new baby. And they were sitting around trying to pick up a name for me. For 5 days, I didn't even have a name. And they were throwing names around like Mary or Rose, good Catholic names. I was born into a very devout Catholic family. And when they couldn't settle down on a name, our neighbor happened to knock on the door. It was around dinner time, and she needed to borrow a loaf of bread because the store was closed. And she walked in and she said, I just need, may I borrow a loaf of bread? And they said, Teresa, I'm glad you stopped by. We are trying to pick up a name for this girl, and we do not know what to choose, Mary or Rose. You pick. And our neighbor looked at my parents, and she said to them, God looked upon you with a tender eye. Why don't you call her tenderness? My Arabic birth name on my baptismal certificate is Hanan, tenderness. And that was the beginning of my story. My parents were overjoyed by my birth. People from the whole town came in bringing presents. Even the church gave my parents incense for presents as a present for me. The whole town was happy and rejoicing of the birth of this little child. I was so blessed and fortunate to be raised in such a loving home with such devout Christian parents who taught me all wonderful things in life. My parents were retired by the time I was born into the family. My father was a businessman. He took all his retirement from the government and he built real estate with it and opened up a restaurant. We had the most famous restaurant in southern Lebanon. And that's where I was born, Lebanon, in the Middle East. Lebanon, my place of birth, used to be known as Paris of the Middle East, the banking capital of the Middle East. I lived a good life. I had all the good things that life had to offer. When I grew up, I had a chauffeur to drive me to school, and we had a live-in maid. Life was wonderful. All this dream came crashing down in 1975. In 1975, war started in Lebanon. Radical Islamists blew up my home, bringing it down, burying me under the rubble wounded. I ended up in a hospital for 2.5 months. And as I laid in a hospital bed, going from one surgery to another, I would ask my father, why did they do this to us? And my father would tell me, because we are Christians, they consider us infidels and they want to kill us. So I learned since I was a 10-year-old little girl that I am wanted dead simply because I was born into the Christian faith and lived in a Christian town. I left the hospital and I came home, but my home was no longer the home I left. We ended up living in a bomb shelter underground in an 8-by-10 room without electricity, without water, and very little food. And this is where I lived for the next 7 years of my life in that bomb shelter, from the age of 10 till the age of 17, robbed of my youth. To get some water, we would crawl to the nearby spring. I come from a town called Marjayoun, Valley of Springs. And we would crawl to a nearby spring to get some water because we were surrounded by Islamic terrorists, snipers shooting at us. And every time before we left our bomb shelter, we would say our last goodbyes because we did not know if we're going to come back alive or dead. We would say our last goodbyes. To get some water, to get some food, we would crawl out of the bomb shelter and get some dandelion, some greenery that grew around our bomb shelter because it was the only salads we had to eat. We lived in the mountains and it was so cold in the wintertime. And my father would go out of the bomb shelter and he would break twigs from the trees in our garden. And he would bring them in and he would pour benzene or mazout or gas on the wood and light a fire. And we would all huddle around the fire because we were so cold. And we had an agreement. Whoever woke up first would wake up the other two and drag them outside because many nights we would pass out because of carbon monoxide poisoning. And this became my existence. When we went into the bomb shelter, people thought, oh, it's only going to be a week or two. The whole world is going to wake up and see what's happening to the Christians in the war in Lebanon. And my father would say, well, America is going to come and save the Christians. Australia is going to come. Canada is going to come. France is going to come. Britain is going to come. And we waited, but nobody came. The world forgot about us. We ended up living in this bomb shelter, turning mattresses on the floor and sleeping on them. Just so cold. I remember my parents turning boxes of coal, putting a blanket on them. And that's where I slept actually the first month we went in. And then we realized nobody's coming. I remember one day, after 3 years we were living in this bomb shelter, we settled into the reality that the world forgot about us. A friend of ours stopped by and he said, Brigitte, I just want you to know that we heard a lot of chatter on the radios and we believe we're going to be attacked tonight. Our town is going to be attacked. And I don't think we're going to last because we had lost so many men and all the young men were fighting and we didn't have any big military. And he said to me, if our town falls tonight and I do not see you tomorrow, I wish you a merciful death. And he left. And I remember dressing in my Sunday best, my Easter dress, because I wanted to look pretty when I am dead, knowing that when they come to slaughter me, there would be no one to bury me. And I remember my mother combing my long black hair down to my hips and tying a white ribbon in my hair that matched the white daisies in my blue dress. As I cried, as I sobbed, begging her, I don't want to die. Please do something. I don't want to die. I'm only 13 years old. And there was nothing my mother could say to me. And we sat in the corner of our bomb shelter. And my father opened up the Bible and started reading from Psalms. I shall walk into the valley of death and fear no evil, for thou art with me. And my parents said to me, when they come to slaughter us tonight, we will create a distraction. You just run towards Israel, run towards the Israeli border and don't look back. We lived a long life, you're a young child. We'll create a distraction and you just run as fast as you can towards the Israeli border. You see, we knew that if we run to the Jews and beg for help, because we lived right on the border with Israel, 5 kilometers from the border, we knew that the Jews are not going to slaughter us because we had more shared values with them than we had with the Islamic terrorists. Thank God I did not have to make that difficult decision that night, because that's the night when Israel came in physically into Lebanon and pushed the radical Islamists around from our town and set up artillery bases surrounding our town so we can stay alive at least. And this went on for another 5 years until Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 and drove the Islamists all the way to Beirut and drove Yasser Arafat and his cronies all the way out of Beirut into Tunisia. And that's how we came out of the bomb shelter and back to rebuilding our lives. I didn't know where my life was going to go. I was taking care of my parents. My mother became wounded in the war, the last shell exploding in our town before she went to the bomb shelter. We had to take my mother to Israel for treatment because Israel was our only lifeline. That's where anybody who was wounded, that's where we went and got treated. I remember my father going to the mattress in our bomb shelter, turning the mattress over and pulling $60 out of it. And he handed it to me and he said, here is some money in case you need it when they take your mother, in case they take her to Israel. And I remember touching money for the first time in my life, because when you're living in a bomb shelter, you don't need money to go shopping. And so I took the money and we found a car and we took my mother. I literally had to flag a car. I stood under the bombs on the streets just screaming anytime I would hear a car flying by. And finally one car stopped. And we put my mother in it and we took her to the hospital that was bombed out hospital in my hometown. They had only fixed up one room and Israel had an Israeli doctor on duty and 2 Israeli nurses to help the doctor. And they gave first aid to my mother. And then we put my mother into an Israeli donated ambulance. And this time the driver was from my hometown and he drove us to the Israeli border where they can take my mother to an Israeli hospital. And we flew. I remember him flying, especially as we were driving in an open area where the Islamists were trying to shell us. And finally we got to the border. They took my mother out of that ambulance and put her inside another Israeli ambulance inside the Israeli border to drive her to Itzfat, the nearest hospital that could give care for my mother and take care of her injury. The Lebanese driver, who actually knew my parents, walked around the ambulance and he said to me, do you have any money for the fee for the ambulance? And as an innocent teenager, I pull all the money out of my pocket and I hand it to him and I said, how much do I owe you? And he looks at my money and he said, give me 30, which was half the money I had. I thanked him for his kindness and I paid him the money and I went and followed my mother. They put my mother inside another Israeli ambulance. And this time the driver was an Israeli soldier who was just called on to serve in the reserve because of the war. They put my mother in that ambulance and we drove her to Itzfat, the nearest hospital that can take care of her injury, which was about an hour away. We arrived to that hospital and I'm thinking to myself, my gosh, if the 10-minute ride cost me $30, I'm sure I don't have enough for this man. We got to the hospital. They took my mother out on a stretcher into the emergency room. And I walked around the ambulance to the Israeli driver and handed him my money saying, how much do I owe you? And he looked at my money and he said, what is this for? And I said, this is the fee for the ambulance. He said, oh no, you don't owe me any money. This is a free service from us to you. I wish your mother a speedy recovery and take good care of yourself. I hope she will be good. And he left. And I felt so touched. I felt so touched. There are no other words. I could not believe his kindness. And then I started thinking, well, first I was so grateful for his kindness. And then I was thinking, I became angry because I realized that the Lebanese driver who actually knew my parents stole my money because I didn't owe him anything for that ambulance. That was my first lesson in the difference between the Arabic culture and the Israeli culture. We got into the hospital and into the emergency room, and there were hundreds of people brought in from the war in Lebanon. It's a war scene. And there were Muslims brought in from Lebanon, Christians brought in from Lebanon, Palestinians brought in from Lebanon, Palestinian terrorists, Israeli soldiers brought in from Lebanon. And I couldn't believe my eyes. The doctors were treating everyone according to their injury. They did not see religion. They did not see political affiliation. They did not see nationality. They helped people in need. That doctor actually helped my mother before he treated the Israeli soldier next to her because her injury was more severe. I couldn't believe my eyes. They took my mother to the 4th floor of that hospital, and they put her in a room where they had brought in earlier that day 2 other women in that room, 1 Druze and 1 Muslim. And we were in the room maybe 5 minutes, and I heard all this commotion outside of our balcony. And people were running from the nurse's station through our room and walking out to the balcony to see what was going on. So I walked out to the balcony to see what was happening. And I looked down, and 2 Israeli helicopters had just landed coming from Lebanon, bringing in Israeli soldiers from Lebanon, carrying them on stretchers, one after another, taking them into the emergency room. And I remember standing at that balcony, just feeling so embarrassed, humiliated, sick to my stomach, feeling out of place, feeling sad that these people are wounded because of the war in Lebanon. I didn't make eye contact with anybody around me because I did not know. I knew everybody had their own sorrows and their own brokenheartedness. I did not know how they're going to react to me. And then all of a sudden, I felt this tapping on my shoulder. And an Israeli nurse was standing next to me, and she said to me, "You are new here, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes. They just brought in my mother. She's in this room." And without skipping a beat, she looks at me and she gives me a hug and she said, "Oh, don't worry. We'll take good care of her. And if you need anything, just call my name. My name is Leah." And I started crying because I was so touched. I experienced compassion that I knew I will not be able to experience in my own country. Because I knew for a fact, if I was a Jew standing on the 4th floor of any hospital in the Middle East, I will be thrown down to my death as shouts of Allahu Akbar would echo through the hospital and down the surrounding street. I could not believe the kindness of the Israeli people. I realized at that moment that everything that the Arabs are fed to their children are lies, are manipulation, are mistruth that are being taught to the children that are so far from reality. I realized that in my own country of Lebanon, kids are brainwashed with lies. I knew that I was amazed at the love that the Israelis were able to show to their enemies. I knew I was a Christian and I was not able to love my enemy and forgive them the way they loved and forgave. And I decided right then and there, those are the people I want to be like. Those are the characters I want to have. I spent 22 days in that hospital. Those days changed my life, changed the way I listen to the news, changed the way I read information. I became friends with a lot of women in the hospital who had their kids wounded in the hospital. One in particular, Rina Potashnik from Pardes Khana, Israel. Her only son, Amir, was wounded in the hospital. And her and she became like my surrogate mother, as my mother was going from one surgery to another, always taken in and out of surgeries. They were working on her. And I would spend a lot of time with Rina. And I remember one time being in Rina's room as the Israeli National Band came to play songs to the Israeli soldiers, to lift the spirits of the Israeli soldiers. And they would play songs like Jerusalem, Yerushalayim Shel Zahab, Jerusalem of Gold, and the Israeli Tikva, the national anthem. And I remember being in Rina's room one day as the band came in to play Jerusalem of Gold. And I started walking backward because I did not want to put Rina in an uncomfortable position. And I was uncomfortable because her son is wounded because of the war with my country. And without skipping a beat, Rina holds my hand and pulls me back into the room. And she said, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." And we both stood there crying. What a difference between a mother like her, a Jewish mother, looking at her son in a serious situation who may not survive, and still able to love me and say, it's not your fault. What a difference between her and Islamic terrorist mother who send their children out to blow Jews and Christians out to smithereen in the name of their religion. What a difference. Those days in the hospital changed my life. It made me realize I want to come back and live in Israel. I want to come back and work in Israel. These are the characters. These are the values I want to have. I had to go back to Lebanon because I'm an only child and I had to take care of my parents. But I vowed that one day I will return to Israel. And I did. I was 20 years old when I returned to Israel as a news anchor for World News in the Middle East. I was so fortunate to get the job. And I ended up reporting on the news, working out of Jerusalem, and I became news anchor for World News. Can you believe it? News anchor for World News. And I ended up reporting on the news night after night after night. And that's when we started seeing a rise of Islamic terror activities across the globe. And I started realizing there was a pattern developing because no matter where the terrorist activity took place, the name of the perpetrators were always Islamic. The name of the victims were always Christians and Jews. And I started realizing that what I used to think was a regional problem between a majority Islamic Middle East trying to either kill or expel the minority Christians and Jews had become a worldwide problem. But the world was not paying attention. The world did not connect the dots. I ended up meeting an American war correspondent in Jerusalem who worked with me at the station. And we ended up getting married. And that's how I came to America, by marriage. I came to America with a child. I immigrated to the United States in 1989. And I thought I left all the crazies behind me. I thought I left all the radicals behind me. I did not want to leave the Middle East until my parents passed away. And I told my husband, as a condition of our marriage, I said, I'm an only child. My parents are too old to leave. I have to be here with them and take care of them. When my parents passed away, and they both died within 9 months of each other, I lost my parents and became an orphan at the age of 22. At 22 years old, I became all alone without my parents in this world. I buried my parents on Mount Zion because I wanted to ensure that my children, yet unborn, will always be drawn to Israel, will always be drawn to Jerusalem. My parents are buried with Oskar Schindler on Mount Zion. If you have ever visited Oskar Schindler's grave, you have walked by my parents. I wanted to honor them and honor their legacy. My father always told me, don't tell people how you feel, show them how you feel. Actions speak louder than words. Actions are everlasting. And I wanted to speak for my children, yet unborn, where my loyalty was. I came to the United States in 1989. And I thought I left all the crazies behind me. I came here to start a new life. It's going to be great. It's going to be America. My whole life story is detailed in my book titled Because They Hate. My first book titled Because They Hate, a survivor of Islamic terrorist warns America. You have to read the story and you have to share it with everyone you know, where you'll find out much more information than what I just shared on this TV show. I started a TV production company, and our clients were Oprah, Dr. Phil, Inside Edition, CBS, ABC, NBC. Life was the bubbles. We had 2 children. I ended up working 6 months out of the year, enjoying the entertainment industry and all the perks of the entertainment industry, being able to have free tickets to any Broadway show I wanted, being able to be offered free tickets on cruises. My kids went to every Broadway show since they were 10 years old. It was wonderful. And I spent the other 6 months playing with my children. 9/11, 2001, changed everything for me. 9/11, 2001 was a defining moment for the United States. 9/11 changed the world. It changed the way we travel. It changed the way we bank. It changed the way we listen to information. It changed the way we listen to news. It changed our lives. 9/11, we all did the same thing. We all were glued to our TV sets, watching television. We were crying. We were sad. We were devastated. We could not believe somebody could hijack airliners and use them as human missiles to fly them into skyscrapers. We could not believe somebody could hate that much. We all did the same thing. 9/11 was especially a defining moment for me. That day, my daughters came home from school and they were watching, because they did not tell them what happened at school that day. And they were watching the images of 9/11, the World Trade Center come down again and again and again. And my youngest daughter, who was around my age, looks at me and she says, "Mommy, why did they do this to us?" And I found myself looking into my daughter's eyes and repeating to her the same words my father said to me when I was 10 years old, laying in a hospital bed, wounded in Lebanon, when I asked him the same question. They hate us because they consider us infidels and they want to kill us. Here we were, 2 generations apart. I was a young girl who spoke Arabic. She's a young girl who speaks English. 2 countries apart, 8,000 miles apart, 2 continents apart, 30 years apart. And I had to repeat to her the same words my daddy said to me. That day was my defining moment. That day I vowed that I will do everything I can to make sure that my daughter will never ever look into her child's eyes and repeat to him or to her what my daddy said to me and what I had said to her. That day I was reborn as an activist. I laid in my couch in my family room. 9/11 happened on a Tuesday morning. I laid in my couch till Sunday in my pajamas, praying, asking God, what can I do to make a difference? What can I do to make a difference? I was watching the images on television and I could smell the smoke that I was watching from the bombs. I knew exactly how that smoke smells like. When parents were yelling the names of their loved ones in the World Trade Center, I could hear my parents yelling my name as I was pinned under a wall in the rubble as they were searching for me. I could feel the heat of the bomb.